In September 1942, Port Moresby, 3 American officers hunched over a table in a sweltering briefing tent, studying a freshly printed map spread before them. The paper was crisp, the lines were clean, and the terrain features were marked with the confidence of men who'd never set foot in the jungle they were planning to conquer. Major William Boyce traced his finger along a thin line snaking through the Owen Stanley Mountains. "The Kokoda Track," he said, reading the notation. "Feasible corridor for troop movement, 60 miles, maybe 70 at most." A captain leaned closer, measuring distances with a ruler. "The terrain looks manageable. Some elevation changes here and here, but nothing our boys can't handle. It's basically a walking path." The third officer, a colonel whose name would soon be forgotten by history, nodded with the kind of certainty that comes from trusting paper more than reality. "We'll have them pushed back to Buna in 2 weeks, 3 outside." They were wrong, very wrong. The Kokoda Track wasn't 60 miles at all. It was 96 kilometers of pure, concentrated hell that would chew up and spit out an entire American division. It would kill more men through terrain than through bullets. It would prove that the most dangerous enemy in war isn't always the one shooting back. And in September 1942, none of these officers knew that yet, because the map in front of them was a complete lie. 6 months earlier, General Douglas MacArthur had arrived in Australia after his dramatic escape from the Philippines. He left thousands of Americans and Filipino soldiers behind to face capture and death, uttering his famous promise, "I shall return." But before he could return anywhere, he had to hold Australia. And Australia's defense, he quickly decided, would be won or lost in New Guinea. MacArthur inherited a mixed bag of forces. The cream of the Australian Imperial Force was in North Africa, fighting Rommel. What remained in Australia were militia battalions, barely trained teenagers who'd never fired a shot in anger. And he had 2 American divisions fresh off the boat, the 32nd Red Arrow Division from Wisconsin and Michigan, and the 41st from the Pacific Northwest. The 32nd were looking good, especially on paper, National Guardsmen with a proud history stretching back to the Civil War. They fought in France during World War I, earning the nickname Les Terribles from the French for their tenacity. Their shoulder patch, a red arrow piercing a line, symbolized their breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line in 1918. But that was 24 years ago. These weren't those men. These were farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, average age 23. Combat experience, 0. Jungle warfare training, a few hasty weeks in the Australian bush that bore no resemblance to the New Guinea interior. Yet MacArthur had confidence. And he had maps, beautiful maps, produced by the Army Map Service, the finest cartographic organization in the world. Maps drawn from pre-war explorer accounts, from aerial reconnaissance photographs taken at 10,000 feet, from the educated guesses of men who'd spent their careers turning data into deployable intelligence. There was just one problem with these maps. None of those who made them had walked a single meter of that jungle. Nobody had felt the mud that could swallow a man to his waist. Nobody had tried to cross those fordable streams when the afternoon rains turned them into raging torrents. Nobody had climbed those moderate slopes that turned out to be near vertical walls of slick vegetation. Nobody had spent a night in the elevated terrain where temperatures plunged to near freezing after days of 100-degree heat. The maps were fiction, beautiful, deadly fiction. Meanwhile, it is 60 miles north. A very different type of soldier was preparing for the same war. The Australian 39th Battalion wasn't impressive by any conventional military standard. They were militia, what the Australians called Chocos, because they'd supposedly melt in the heat like chocolate soldiers. Most were teenagers from Victoria, barely out of school. Average age, 18. They'd been in New Guinea for months, but mostly they'd been building things, not fighting. They weren't special forces. They weren't elite troops. They were kids with rifles who'd rather have been home. But they had something the Americans didn't, something that couldn't be printed on any map, something that couldn't be photographed from 10,000 feet, something that centuries of military tradition and technological superiority couldn't provide. They had Papuan guides. These men were born in these kinds of mountains, men who knew every stream, every ridge, every hidden trail, men who could read the jungle the way MacArthur's officers read their maps, except these men were reading the truth, and they had officers, like Lieutenant Bert Kinzel, who'd spent years as a patrol officer in the region. Kinzel had walked the Kokoda Track. He knew it wasn't a feasible corridor. He knew it was a nightmare of vertical slopes, bottomless mud, and terrain that could kill you just as dead as any Japanese bullet. The Australians didn't trust their maps. They trusted their guides. And that difference would save hundreds of Australian lives, while American confidence would cost them thousands. On July 21, 1942, the academic discussion became brutally real. Japanese forces landed at Buna and Gona on New Guinea's northern coast. Major General Tomitaro Horii led the South Seas Detachment, battle-hardened troops who'd conquered half of Asia. Their objective was simple: cross the Owen Stanley Mountains, capture Port Moresby, and cut Australia off from American supply lines. The only thing standing between them and Port Moresby was the Kokoda Track, and whoever controlled that track controlled Australia's future. The race was on. But it was a race where one side had accurate information and the other had beautiful maps, where one side moved with caution, born of knowledge, and the other with confidence, born from ignorance, where teenage Australian militiamen would face impossible odds with nothing but local wisdom to guide them, and where American National Guardsmen would walk into terrain their maps swore didn't exist. The Japanese were coming. The Australians were ready in their own unprepared way. And the Americans were studying their maps, calculating march times, planning supply routes, and believing every lie the paper told them. They will learn the truth soon enough that by then it would be too late for thousands of them. The question wasn't whether the maps were wrong. The question was how many men would die before anyone admitted it. Then, on September 15, 1942, the first C-47 transport planes touched down at Port Moresby, carrying men of the 32nd Division's 126th and 128th Infantry Regiments. For many of these Wisconsin and Michigan farm boys, it was the first time they'd ever been in an airplane. They stumbled off the transports into tropical heat that hit them like a physical wall, squinting against sunlight that seemed to burn through their retinas. They had their orders: take the Kappa Trail, circle around the Japanese eastern flank, and hit them from behind while the Australians pushed from the south. It was a brilliant strategy on paper. One small detail, though: no white man had successfully crossed the Kappa Trail since 1917. The maps didn't mention that. They stepped off into the jungle on October 6, 1942. Within those hours, they knew that something was catastrophically wrong. The first soldier to sink waist-deep in a swamp that didn't exist on his map probably thought it was just bad luck. By the time the 10th, 20th, 50th man disappeared into mud that the cartographers had marked as solid ground, they realized the truth. Their maps were fantasies. Streams marked as fordable turned out to be raging torrents that swept men and equipment downstream. The afternoon rains, which no one had warned them about, turned every water crossing into a life-or-death struggle. Men drowned in rivers. Their maps swore they could walk across. The clear ground turned out to be kunai grass 10 feet tall, with edges sharp enough to slice through uniforms and skin. Entire companies vanished into the grass, unable to see their own squad leaders 5 feet away. Officers lost control of their units not through enemy action, but through simple vegetation. And the temperature, good God. The maps showed elevation. They showed terrain. They didn't show what it felt like to march with a 70-pound pack through 100-degree heat with 90% humidity, where men collapsed from heat exhaustion after an hour, where your canteen was empty by noon, and the next water source was marked on the map 5 miles ahead, except when you got there, it didn't exist. Private First Class Robert Hartley from Milwaukee later wrote home, "The map said it was 3 miles to the next checkpoint. It took us 11 hours. Half the company couldn't walk by the end. The map didn't show the mountains we had to climb, the swamps we had to cross, or the fact that we'd be doing it in hell." But the real nightmare was Ghost Mountain. The 126th Infantry Regiment drew the worst assignment. They were ordered to cross a 2,800-meter gap near Mount Aubrey. The map labeled it simply Elevated Terrain. That's military cartography for there's a hill here. Ghost Mountain wasn't a hill. It was a vertical wall of jungle that rose nearly 2 miles into the sky. The men stared up at it from their staging area, watching clouds form at the summit, and understood they'd been sent on a mission their maps had made look easy, but was actually impossible. Still, orders were orders. On October 14th, they began to climb. The native porters took one look at the route ahead, dropped their loads, and melted back into the jungle. Can't blame them, they knew what the Americans didn't. You don't cross Ghost Mountain, you die on Ghost Mountain. The Americans were now carrying their own 70-pound packs, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, weapons, shelter halves, 70 pounds per man, straight up slopes that in some places required pulling yourself hand over hand on vines and roots. No trails. The maps showed trails. There were no trails, no water. The maps showed streams every few miles. The only water came from rain collected in helmets. The cold. At elevation, temperatures plunged from tropical heat to near freezing. The men had uniforms designed for heat. Nobody told them they'd be sleeping in mud at altitude where their body heat drained away through the ground. 42 days. It took the 126th Infantry 42 days to cross terrain. Their map suggested would take 10. E Company arrived at Saputo on November 20th with barely enough men to form a single platoon. They'd lost more men to the terrain than they would to the Japanese. They started calling themselves the Ghost Battalion, men who'd walked into terrain that didn't exist and somehow walked back out. November 16th, 1942. After weeks of hell just getting to the battlefield, the 32nd Division finally reached the Buna perimeter. Their maps showed Japanese positions as light fortifications, maybe some trenches, a few log bunkers, nothing serious. The maps showed open approaches to these positions, clear lanes for infantry assault. The reality was a masterpiece of defensive engineering hidden in a swamp. Reinforced concrete bunkers with 3-foot-thick walls, firing ports at ground level, interlocking fields of fire, all of it concealed in terrain that made approach by infantry nearly impossible. The open approaches were actually narrow trails through chest-deep swamp, where men couldn't run, couldn't take cover, couldn't do anything but wade forward into machine gun fire. On November 19th, the first American assault began. Within hours, the casualty reports made seasoned officers sick. Companies that went forward at full strength came back with a quarter of their men, soldiers stuck in chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns fired at leisure. No way to advance, no way to retreat. They were just standing there, dying. The Americans couldn't see the enemy positions their maps claimed to have identified. Every bunker was perfectly camouflaged. Every field of fire was a trap. The Japanese had prepared these defenses for months. The American maps were drawn from aerial photos that showed nothing. The 128th Infantry advanced through what their maps showed as firm ground, leading to light enemy positions. 78 men went forward, 23 came back, 30 minutes. That's how long it took to lose 75% of a company because a map lied about terrain and enemy strength. By November 30th, General Edwin Harding had to report the unthinkable to MacArthur. The 32nd Division had suffered 492 casualties and gained virtually no ground. The division was stuck, dying in swamps that weren't supposed to exist, facing defenses that weren't supposed to be there, on terrain that bore no resemblance to their maps. MacArthur didn't want to hear it. The maps said this should be easy. He'd planned the operation based on those maps. If Harding couldn't take Buna, MacArthur would find someone who could. He summoned Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, handed him the mission, and gave him an order that would become infamous. "Bob, I want you to take Buna, or not come back alive, and that goes for your chief of staff too." The problem was, Eichelberger had the same maps Harding did, maps that turned soldiers into corpses. By the year's end, the statistics told a story of systematic failure, ground intelligence almost non-existent. The maps provided no useful information about actual conditions. Malaria rate nearly 100%. Disease was killing 4 to 5 times more men than combat. The division was being destroyed, not by Japanese bullets, but by American confidence in paper. Time magazine, December 1942. Nowhere in the world today are American soldiers engaged in fighting so desperate, so merciless, so bitter, or so bloody. One GI standing chest deep in a swamp that didn't exist on his map, watching friends die from positions they couldn't see, wrote in his diary, "God help us, we're never going to get out of here alive." Meanwhile, 60 miles south, Australian units were fighting the same enemy in the same terrain. And they were winning. What did they know that the Americans didn't? And how many more Americans are going to die before someone admitted the maps were killing them? On July 6, 1942, Lieutenant Bert Kienzl stood at the edge of the Kokoda Track, watching the B Company of the 39th Battalion prepare to move out. He had a map in his hand, the same type of map the Americans would rely on months later. He looked at it, looked at the terrain ahead, and stuffed the map back in his pack. "Forget what the paper says," he told Captain Sam Templeton. "I'll show you the real track." Kienzl wasn't a soldier. He was a patrol officer who'd spent years walking these mountains. He knew every village, every stream crossing, every ridge where the weather could turn from tropical to Arctic in an hour. He knew things that no cartographer sitting in Melbourne could ever put on paper. And he knew something else. The map was a polite fiction, useful for general orientation maybe, for actual navigation, for keeping men alive, worthless. The 39th Battalion had another advantage the Americans would never have. Fighting alongside them was the Papuan Infantry Battalion, men who weren't just familiar with this terrain. They were born here. This jungle wasn't their enemy. It was their home. That difference would save hundreds of lives. The contrast in approach was stark from day one. In Port Moresby, American staff officers studied maps in headquarters tents, tracing routes with rulers, calculating march times based on distances that looked clean on paper. They worked in relative comfort, trusting that their technical superiority, the best cartography in the world, would see them through. The Australians sent patrols, constantly, daily. They talked to locals. They listened to Papuan guides who'd tell them things like, "That stream, it's ankle deep now, but after afternoon rain it's 10 feet and moving fast enough to sweep a man away." They updated their intelligence based on what soldiers actually encountered, not what maps said they should encounter. Lieutenant Don Simonson of the 39th Battalion kept notes of his first encounter with the Kokoda Track. His words captured what no map could show. "Well, we moved into a country that we had never dreamt of before. It changed so much depending on the height of the mountain range through which we were traveling as to what we came up against. At the highest peaks there was moss forest and leeches by the millions, and although we were wearing leggings, they could somehow get in. Within a short distance you would find a mass of blood around the bottom of your legs, and these would be full of leeches, dropping off and lying on your socks. Leeches by the millions. That detail appears on exactly 0 American maps. The Americans would discover it the same way Simonson did, by experience. The difference was the Australians knew it was coming. Their Papuan guides had warned them. The Papuan Infantry Battalion soldiers knew things that seemed like magic to white soldiers from Melbourne or Brisbane. They knew which streams flooded violently and which stayed manageable. They knew which ridges became impassable in rain and which remained viable. They knew where to find water sources that didn't appear on any map. They knew which plants were edible, which provided shelter, which would kill you if you touched them. They knew the timing. Every afternoon, without fail, torrential rain. The morning might be clear, hot, deceptively manageable. By 2 p.m., the sky opened up. Streams became rivers. Trails became mudslides. Visibility dropped to meters. The temperature plunged. This happened every single day. It was as predictable as sunrise. The American maps showed none of this temporal variability, static snapshots of terrain that was never static. The Australians knew better because their guides told them, plan your movement for morning, be in defensive positions by afternoon, survive the rain, repeat. The Owen Stanley Range itself was a study in extremes the maps couldn't capture. The track rose to 2,200 meters through moss. Forest where everything was wet, cold, and alien. Temperature swings from 100-degree tropical heat at lower elevations to near freezing at the peaks. Your uniform, soaked with sweat at the bottom, would freeze on your body at the top. The maps showed elevation numbers. They didn't show what those numbers meant to human bodies trying to fight a war. July 23, 1942. B Company, 39th Battalion, under Captain Sam Templeton, made first contact with Japanese forces near Awala. The Australians were outnumbered roughly 10 to 1. On paper, this should have been a massacre. It wasn't, because Templeton and his men had something the Japanese didn't expect: intimate knowledge of every meter of ground they were fighting on. Templeton destroyed the bridge over the Kumusi River, not because a map told him it was strategically important, but because Papuan scouts told him it was the only viable crossing point for miles, when roughly 50 Japanese soldiers appeared on the opposite bank. The Australians were already in position, firing from cover that existed in reality, but not on any map. The Japanese had maps too, good ones actually, drawn from the same pre-war sources as the American maps. Those maps told them there should be several crossing points. There weren't. They told them certain ridges offered good approach routes. They didn't. The Japanese spent the entire campaign discovering that their maps were as fictional as the American ones. But the Australians, their Papuan guides, had shown them the real terrain. They set ambushes based on where men actually walked, not where maps said they should walk. They positioned themselves where the jungle naturally channeled movement. They knew the ground. That knowledge was worth more than numerical superiority. July 29, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel William Owen commanded 80 men defending Kokoda village against hundreds of Japanese attackers. He knew the mathematics were impossible. He also knew the ground. As the Japanese prepared their assault, Owen walked the perimeter, checking each position personally. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Garland, intercepted him. "Sir, I think you are taking an unnecessary risk walking around among the troops like that." Owen stopped, looked at the young lieutenant, and said simply, "Well, I've got to do it." Half an hour later, a Japanese bullet found him, shot through the forehead, dead before he hit the ground. The 39th Battalion lost Kokoda that night, but they retreated in good order, fighting the entire way, because every man in the battalion knew exactly where they were going. Their Papuan guides led them through the darkness to positions they'd already scouted. They knew which trails were viable at night, which weren't. They knew where to make stands, where to fall back. The battalion took casualties, heavy casualties, but they survived as a fighting force because they never relied on maps alone. They fought, they retreated, they regrouped, always knowing the ground beneath their feet. Compare that to Buna, 4 months later. Americans stuck in swamps their maps swore didn't exist, unable to retreat because they didn't know where they were, unable to advance because the terrain bore no resemblance to their intelligence. The 32nd Division didn't survive Buna. It was destroyed there, rebuilt, and destroyed again. The difference? The Australians never trusted paper over people. While Americans were still relying on pre-war maps drawn from explorer accounts, the Australian Survey Corps was revolutionizing military cartography in real time. Survey teams followed combat units into the field, not months later for post-battle analysis. Immediately, they mapped actual terrain, actual conditions, actual elevations. When soldiers reported that a fordable stream was actually an impassable torrent, that information went straight to the cartographers. When Papuan guides identified a ridge as seasonal, passable in dry season, suicide in wet, that made it onto the map. By October 1943, the Australian Survey Corps received an official commendation from General MacArthur himself. The citation read, "Great technical difficulties were surmounted in producing and distributing maps and photomaps covering more than 12,000 square miles. 12,000 square miles, 1,419 different maps, 3 million copies printed, and every single one stamped with reliability ratings. This section was verified by ground survey. That section is based on aerial photography with ground control points. This other section is preliminary, use with caution. The American maps had no such ratings. Every map looked equally authoritative, equally reliable. They weren't. The Australians used aerial photography too, but correctly. They took the photos, then sent teams on the ground to verify what they were seeing. Is that a stream or a shadow? Is that elevation change 10 meters or 100? They didn't guess. They checked. They employed local guides to confirm map features. They updated maps based on soldier reports from the field. By 1943, they were producing the most accurate battlefield maps in the Pacific Theater. The Americans had the Army Map Service, the best cartographic organization in the world by technical standards. The Australians had Papuan guides and survey teams that actually walked the ground. The Australians saved lives. The Americans killed their own men with confidence. The tragedy is, the Australians tried to share their intelligence. Australian liaison officers approached American commanders, offering to provide updated maps, offering to share their methodology, offering to explain why the pre-war maps were lethal. The response was polite dismissal. We have the Army Map Service, the best in the world. American technological superiority was an article of faith. The idea that teenage Australian militiamen and barefoot Papuan guides knew things the U.S. Army didn't? Unthinkable. One Australian officer, frustrated after watching American casualties mount at Buna, finally said it bluntly, "Your maps are killing your men." He wasn't wrong, but admitting it would mean admitting that American technical superiority had failed. That locals knew better, that the mighty U.S. Army had been beaten not by the Japanese, but by its own arrogance. How many men died before that admission came? And what would it take to finally force the truth into the open? December 1942. 6 weeks into the Buna offensive, and American soldiers were still dying in swamps that weren't supposed to exist. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger had done everything a commander could do. He'd relieved officers. He'd led from the front, exposing himself to enemy fire to shame his men forward. He'd reorganized units, changed tactics, and called for more supplies. Nothing worked, because every attack plan was based on maps that bore no resemblance to reality. And 60 miles away, the Australian 7th Division was winning. To be precise about how wrong the American maps was, area marked dry ground suitable for infantry advance, actually chest-deep swamp where men couldn't run, couldn't take cover, couldn't do anything but wade slowly through water while Japanese machine guns fired at leisure. Soldiers described it as trying to fight while drowning in slow motion. Area marked light vegetation, actually jungle so dense that visibility dropped to 5 meters, vines thick as your wrist, trees whose roots formed natural bunkers, undergrowth that had to be hacked away meter by meter. One company spent an entire day advancing 200 yards through light vegetation. They lost 18 men doing it. Stream marked fordable, 2 feet deep. Actually a crocodile-infested channel running 10 feet deep, with current strong enough to sweep away equipment. 3 men drowned trying to cross what their map promised was a minor obstacle. The crocodiles got 2 more. Enemy positions marked on the map. The red symbols showed Japanese bunkers roughly 200 meters from their actual locations. American artillery, firing based on map coordinates, dropped shells into empty swamp, while the real Japanese positions, invisible, perfectly camouflaged, cut down every infantry assault. The maps weren't just inaccurate, they were lethal. Meanwhile, the Australian 7th Division approached Gona with a completely different methodology. They sent Papuan scouts forward, not to fight, to observe. These scouts moved through terrain they'd known their entire lives, located actual Japanese positions, noted actual terrain conditions, and reported back with information you couldn't get from any map. There's a bunker here, not where the map shows it. The approach is through swamp, but there's a ridge 50 meters west that's passable. The Japanese have fields of fire covering the obvious routes, but there's a creek bed they haven't covered. This was intelligence you couldn't photograph from 10,000 feet. This was knowledge that required walking the ground. Australian artillery fired on actual Japanese positions. Australian infantry advanced through terrain their scouts had verified. Australian casualties were heavy. This was still brutal combat, but they weren't dying because their maps lied to them. December 9, 1942, the Australians took Guinea. The Americans were still stuck at Buna, dying in swamps. Their maps swore were solid ground. Late December brought a potential breakthrough. Australian Stuart tanks, light American-made tanks that had proven effective in Australian hands, were finally brought forward to support the American assault. On paper, it was brilliant. Tanks to break through Japanese bunkers, armor to suppress machine gun positions, mobile firepower to overcome defensive advantages. There was just one problem. The solid ground where tanks were supposed to advance wasn't solid. It was a swamp. The same swamp American infantry had been drowning in for weeks. The same swamp their maps had marked as suitable for heavy equipment. The first tank made it 20 meters before sinking to its treads. Engineers spent 2 days extracting it. The second tank learned from this, tried a different route the maps showed as firm, and promptly sank even deeper. The solution required engineers to build corduroy roads, logs laid perpendicular to the direction of travel, creating artificial solid ground. Every meter of road took hours to construct. The maps had shown none of this as necessary. The maps had promised tank-suitable terrain that simply didn't exist. American engineers working under fire, building roads through swamps that weren't supposed to be there, finally understood what the Australians had known from day one. You can't trust paper in the jungle. You have to trust people who know the ground. On January 3, 1943, after 49 days of continuous combat, Buna finally fell. The 32nd Division had started the operation with roughly 10,000 men. By the end, they'd suffered 2,900 casualties. Nearly 1 in 3 soldiers who went into Buna came out dead or wounded. But here's the horror. The Japanese didn't kill most of them. The terrain did. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, exhaustion, men collapsing from heat stroke because their maps didn't warn them about the conditions, men drowning in swamps that weren't supposed to exist, men dying of infected wounds because evacuation routes marked on maps turned out to be impassable. Lieutenant General Eichelberger, the man MacArthur had ordered to take Buna or not come back alive, wrote in his official report, "Our troops were in no sense ready for jungle warfare." That was diplomatic language for a brutal truth. We sent men to fight based on maps that were fantasies, and we killed them with our ignorance. The official U.S. Army review of the Buna campaign used careful military language. Ground intelligence was almost non-existent. Translation: we had no idea what we were walking into. The maps were worse than useless. They were actively harmful. They created false confidence, enabled catastrophically bad planning, and killed soldiers who trusted them. The Australian methodology, Papuan guides, constant ground verification, real-time intelligence updates, had proven vastly superior. But admitting that would require admitting that American technical superiority had failed, that illiterate jungle guides knew more than MIT-educated cartographers. That admission took time and blood. MacArthur's response came swiftly after Buna. No more Bunas, he decreed. He ordered a complete restructuring of intelligence gathering. He mandated jungle warfare training based on Australian methods. He finally, reluctantly, admitted that American maps were inadequate. But the admission came too late for the 930 Americans killed at Buna, Guinea. Too late for the 1,970 wounded. Too late for the thousands more who survived physically, but were destroyed psychologically by an experience that should never have happened. Compare the numbers. The Australians lost 1,204, killed in the entire Papua campaign, a campaign that lasted months longer and covered vastly more terrain than Buna. They fought with smaller forces, less equipment, teenage militiamen who'd barely completed basic training, but their casualty rates were lower because their maps didn't lie to them, because they listened to the locals, because they verified everything, because they understood that the jungle would kill you faster than any enemy if you didn't respect it. The Australian Survey Corps never made headlines. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were surveyors and cartographers walking behind combat troops with theodolites and surveying equipment, making sure the maps matched reality. But those unglamorous men with their mundane equipment saved hundreds of Australian lives, while American cartographers in climate-controlled offices produced beautiful maps that killed American soldiers. On October 19, 1943, General MacArthur signed a commendation for the Australian Survey Corps. It praised their worthy efforts in surmounting great technical difficulties to produce accurate maps. 9 months after Buna, 9 months after the disaster that proved American mapping methods lethal, 9 months of additional casualties before the lesson fully penetrated. The question that haunts military historians to this day: how many of those 930 American dead at Buna would have survived if anyone had listened to the Australians in the first place? How many men died because American pride couldn't admit that barefoot Papuan guides knew more than the best cartographic service in the world? We'll never know, but we know the maps killed them as surely as any Japanese bullet. Finally, the Americans learned in 1943. Survey teams now accompanied combat units into the field, not months later for historical documentation. Immediately during active operations, they carried the same theodolites and measuring equipment as the Australians. More importantly, they carried the same attitude: verify everything. Local guides were consulted, not as quaint additions to operations, but as primary intelligence sources. When a Papuan villager said that ridge is impassable in afternoon rain, that information went directly onto the map with the same weight as aerial photography. And for the first time, American maps carried reliability ratings. This section was verified by ground survey, use with confidence. That section is based on aerial photography only, use with caution. This area preliminary intelligence, verify before operations. The maps finally told the truth about what they knew and what they didn't. The numbers tell the story of transformation. The Australian Survey Corps produced 1,419 maps during the Pacific Campaign. They engaged 5,500 men in mapping operations. Every map was ground verified. Every map could be trusted. The American Army Map Service produced 40,000 maps for the entire war, an impressive number that masked a critical flaw. The Pacific Theater had received rushed, unverified products drawn from pre-war sources, quantity without quality, technical sophistication without ground truth. By late 1943, Australian-style verification became standard across all Allied Pacific operations. The lesson had been learned. The price was 930 American dead at Buna and countless others across New Guinea. April 1944, the Hollandia operation demonstrated how dramatically things had changed. American forces used Australian verified maps showing actual terrain, actual elevations, actual Japanese positions. The invasion that MacArthur's staff had feared might become another Buna turned into a textbook success. Casualties minimal, objectives achieved rapidly, terrain exactly as advertised on the maps. The difference? Accurate intelligence, maps that matched reality, ground truth verified by people who'd actually walked the terrain. 1 year after Buna, American forces proved they'd learned the lesson. They just had to kill 930 of their own men first. Post-war U.S. Army studies pulled no punches. The official analysis concluded Buna was a preventable disaster. Primary cause, inadequate terrain intelligence. Recommended solution, permanently adopt mapping methods pioneered by the Australian Survey Corps. The legacy was clear: American technological confidence, the belief that superior equipment and technical expertise could overcome any challenge, had nearly cost us the Pacific War. The Australians, with simpler methods but commitment to ground truth, had saved lives through humility and verification. The best equipment in the world means nothing without accurate information. A farmer with a compass who knows the ground will beat a general with perfect maps showing fictional terrain. The Australians understood this in 1942. The Americans learned it in blood. The final irony still stings. MacArthur signed that commendation for the Australian Survey Corps on October 19, 1943, praising their worthy efforts and great technical difficulties surmounted 18 months after the Papua campaign began, 9 months after Buna finally fell. How many Americans died in those 18 months because MacArthur and his staff trusted American maps over Australian methodology? We'll never know the exact number, but we know it's measured in thousands. The lesson echoes through military history. Fast forward to Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003. American forces with GPS, satellite imagery, LiDAR terrain mapping, technology the World War II generation couldn't have imagined. And yet the most valuable intelligence still comes from locals who know the ground. The high-tech imagery shows you what's there. The local shepherd tells you where the Taliban hide when helicopters approach, which wadis flood in spring, which villages support insurgents. Ground truth remains irreplaceable. The Australians knew this in 1942. We're still relearning it today. Visit the Kokoda Track today, and you'll walk across land owned by the Koyari and Orokaiva peoples, the traditional owners, the same people whose ancestors guided Australian soldiers to victory in 1942. Their knowledge saved thousands of Allied lives, not just Australian, American too eventually, once we started listening. Knowledge passed down through generations, earned through lifetimes of living in terrain that outsiders could never truly understand. No American map, no matter how technically sophisticated, could match what those guides knew: the temperature patterns, the rain cycles, the hidden water sources, the trails that existed but weren't visible from the air, the swamps that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. They knew the jungle was alive, that it changed, that paper couldn't capture it, and they tried to tell us. The tragedy is how long it took us to listen. Over 600 Australian soldiers were killed on the Kokoda Track, and 2,900 American casualties at Buna alone. How many lived because Australians mapped correctly? How many died because Americans didn't? The mathematics is brutal. The Australians fought longer, over more terrain, with smaller forces and less equipment. But their casualty rates were lower because they respected what they didn't know. The Americans came in confident. Superior technology, superior training, superior everything except superior maps. And in the jungle, that one failure killed thousands. By September 1942, those American officers studying their maps in Port Moresby, tracing the Kokoda Track with confident fingers, will have them pushed back to Buna in 2 weeks. Now we know what they didn't. Those maps were beautiful lies. The track wasn't a feasible corridor. It was 96 kilometers of vertical hell. The terrain wasn't manageable. It was specifically designed by nature to kill anyone who didn't respect it. The Japanese weren't in light fortifications. They were in concrete bunkers, invisible to aerial photography. The maps were fiction. The jungle was real, and it killed anyone who trusted paper over people. The Australians understood this from day one. They walked the ground. They listened to the locals. They verified everything. They survived. The Americans had to learn it in blood. 930 lives worth of education, thousands more wounded. An entire division was destroyed, all because we believed our maps more than we believed the people who actually knew the terrain. The jungle taught us humility. We should have learned it from the Australians. But pride is expensive, and in war, pride is paid for in body bags. What other World War II battles fascinate you? Have you walked the Kokoda Track? Do you know a veteran who fought in New Guinea? Comment below. Share their stories. Let's remember their sacrifice and the lesson they died to teach us. Sometimes the best technology in the world can't beat local knowledge. Sometimes the most important map is the one drawn by someone who's actually been there. The Australians knew this in 1942. The Americans learned it at Buna. How many more times do we need to relearn this lesson before it sticks?